Hello everyone. In this video, let's try to understand the two different deployment models in Azure. There are two different ways in which you can deploy your resources in Azure. They are the classic deployment model and the Azure Resource Manager deployment model. They both represent two different ways in which you can deploy and manage your resources. So when you create resources with these two different deployment models, you work with completely different APIs and the deployed resources itself are very different. If you have been using Azure 3 to 4 years back, you would have probably used the classic deployment model to deploy your resources. This classic deployment model is also called as Azure Service Manager, and the latest Azure Resource Manager model is the Microsoft recommended way to deploy your resources. For your exam and in this course, I will be talking about working with Resource Manager deployment model. So why we have these two different deployment models and what are the differences? In the classic model, when you build a solution, you need to create each resource independently. For example, if you are creating a web application, you need to create the front-end web app, the database, and the virtual network resources independently that are required for your application. So you create independently, you manage them independently, you track them independently, you deploy them independently, and you delete them independently. There is no way that you can group your resources. A few years back, Azure introduced a resource manager model which added the concept of a resource group. A resource group is a container for your Azure resources that share a common life cycle. So you could place all the different components that make up your application into the same resource group. For example, you could place the front-end web app, the database, the virtual network, and the virtual machine, which are part of the same solution within a single resource group, and you could manage the resources together. Let's look at some of the benefits of Resource Manager deployment model over the classic model. As discussed, you deploy, manage, track all the resources for your solution as a group rather than managing them individually. In a simple template file, you can use JavaScript object notation or JSON to define the infrastructure for your solution. You can also define the dependencies between resources so that they are always deployed in the correct order. To the contrary, in the classic model, you need to remember to deploy the resources in the correct order. You can apply tags to resources to logically organize the resources in your subscription, and you can use these tags for the purpose of billing. So before going into demo, let me review a few key terms. A resource is the Azure service that you create. You create resources like a virtual machine, virtual network, SQL database, and so on. A resource group is a container that holds related resource for an Azure solution. A resource provider is a service that supplies the resources. For example, the resource provider Microsoft.compute supplies the virtual machine resource. The resource provider Microsoft.storage supplies the storage account resource, and so on. And finally, a resource manager template is a JavaScript object notation file that defines your Azure resources, and you can use this template to deploy all the resources for your application at once rather than deploying them one at a time. Once you log into your Azure portal, you will see a dashboard that contains or displays the list of resources. I have not created any resource and that's why it is empty right now. And on the left panel, you will see a list of resources that you can create. If you would like to see a detailed list, then just go to create a resource. Then you can see the list of popular resources and the marketplace and the list of categories under which you can create individual resources. So you can select any one of the resource and just say create a resource. So let me close that and let me talk about resource group. So to create a resource group, just select resource group option and I do not have any resource groups now. So let me create a resource group. So let me specify a name and the subscription under which this resource group will belong and the resource group location. So you can choose from any of the different locations. Note that this is the location where the metadata for your resource group will be stored. And also note that your individual services can be in any number of different locations and it need not be in the same location as your resource group. So let me create the resource group. And once created, you will get a notification like this saying the resource group has been created. And let me refresh the page and you will see a resource group that's been created. It is empty right now because there are no resources within this resource group. You can of course go and create resources within this resource group. So you will see a bunch of resources that you can create, but I will not create anything right now. Other than the UI or the portal, Azure also gives you the option to interact with your Azure resources through the PowerShell commands. So to run PowerShell commands, you can run from your local system or directly from the Azure portal as well. So let me show you how to run the PowerShell commands from your Azure portal. So to do that, first you need to create a Cloud Shell session. So once you click that, you will get a welcome screen saying it will create an Azure Cloud Shell. So you can choose either the Linux or the Windows one. So let me say PowerShell Linux and choose the subscription where it needs to create a storage account. And within the storage account, it will store the metadata for this cloud session. So let me say create a storage. So what happens behind the scenes is that it will create a new resource group called Cloud Shell Storage and the location where this particular resource group is stored. And within that resource group, it will also create a storage account. So it has created, and let me refresh this resource group, and if I bring this down, you note that it has created a storage account, and within the storage account it will create a file share where it will persist the contents of your interaction. So let me pull this up. To see the list of resource providers and its registration status, you can use the command get Azure RM resource provider and it will list the available resource provider for your subscription. So these are a few of the resource providers for your subscription, and note that some of the resource providers are not in a registered state. If a resource provider is not in a registered state, you cannot go and interact with the resources it provides. So now let's talk about one of the most important or one of the most common resource providers, which is Microsoft.compute. So to view more information about Microsoft.compute, just use the command get Azure RM resource provider and just provide Microsoft.compute as the provider namespace. Note that these two different terms here, they are like key value pairs. The provider namespace is the key and the Microsoft.compute is the value. And note that all the different PowerShell commands, they start with a verb. So it's always get, set, register and so on. And here it is Azure RM because we are using the Azure Resource Manager deployment model and not the classic deployment model. So the entire command name is kind of really intuitive. So it is saying get the details of my resource provider and use Azure RM, which means that use Resource Manager deployment model to talk to. So if I run this command, I should be able to see the list of resource types that it provides. For example, you note that it provides availability sets, it provides virtual machines, virtual machine extensions, virtual machine scale set, and so on. So that's about your resource provider. Let's talk about the Azure Resource Manager template or the ARM template. So go to Google and just type Azure Resource Manager template and go to the GitHub page. So within the GitHub page, you will see a list of quick start templates. There are lots and lots of different templates and you can just select one just to view how the syntax looks like. So there is a template called function app, create dedicated function app. So let me click that. And once you go into Azure deploy.json, so this is the JSON file which creates the definition to create the resources. So this is how your ARM template or Azure Resource Manager template looks like. Do not worry about the details of it. We will go into these details much later. But just note that it deploys the list of resources at once. Whereas if you are using the PowerShell or the Azure portal to deploy your resources, you would do them one at a time. So this is very popular way of deploying the Azure resources. And I just thought you need to know this upfront. In this video, you learned about the two different deployment models in Azure, and you have also seen how the Resource Manager deployment model works. In the next video, we will talk about role-based access control in Azure.